No, I don't like waiting around. I have a poker game in Cairo on Thursdays.
This is Mike Sadler. If you look him up online, it will tell you he was the last surviving original SAS member, but he is so much more than that. Mike Sadler was the man who always knew exactly where everyone was, even in a desert that looked like God copy-pasted the same dune 1,000 times. SAS Rogue Heroes paints him as a calm, brainy navigator who somehow keeps his unit from driving into a sand dune or a German tank column. And honestly, they weren't far off. But what the show doesn't quite capture is just how extraordinary his real navigation skills were.
In the desert, everything can be predicted!
He didn't just get the SAS from point A to point B.
With all due respect, sir, I'm fucking sick of being the taxi service.
He got them across hundreds of miles of featureless, boiling desert. He used stars, shadows, and instinct, and what only can be described as a built-in sat-nav before the rest of the world invented one. So get comfortable as we go through the story of Major Willis Michael Sadler, one of the infamous Rogue Heroes. Sadler was born in Kensington, London in 1916, but his story really gets moving when his family relocated to the countryside near Stroud in Gloucestershire. He was educated at Bedales, a school famous for its Montessori approach, which basically means when other students were learning Latin or how to stand up straight, Bedales pupils were learning how to think for themselves. It was probably the perfect training ground for a man who would later look at an officer's bad orders, shrug, and say, nah. He left school in 1937, and instead of attending university or joining a fancy London firm, he packed up his life and moved to Rhodesia to work on a farm. Because why not? When the Second World War erupted, Sadler was still on a tobacco farm in southern Rhodesia, and naturally he joined the Rhodesian army, climbed the ranks quickly, until he told an officer exactly what he thought of his bad decision-making. His commanding officer threatened to strip him of the rank unless he apologised. So Sadler, never one to play along with the nonsense, said he'd save them the trouble and reduce his rank. This is a moment that every viewer of Rogue Heroes might recognise, the quiet man who refuses to tolerate stupidity. His life changed in a Cairo bar, as so many great SAS stories do, when he was invited to join the newly formed Long Range Desert Group. The Long Range Desert Group was an elite reconnaissance and raiding unit of the British Army during the Second World War. This story began in June 1914 in Egypt as the Long Range Patrol, created by Major Bagnold under the direction of General Archibald Wavell. Bagnold was supported by Captain Patrick Clayton and Captain William Shaw in building the new unit. Most of the early volunteers came from New Zealand, but later Southern Rhodesia and British volunteers got involved. As its structure expanded, its name was changed to the now famous Long Range Desert Group. Despite its impact, the unit never exceeded 350 volunteers. So the Long Range Desert Group were the original desert raiders, the people who knew the Libyan sands like the back of their hand. And on the 700-mile journey from Cairo to the LRDG base at Kufra, Sadler became obsessed with the way these men navigated, plotting courses by stars, the position of the sun, and the subtlest clues in the sand. He later said it was like being at sea. The maps were mostly blank, marked only with latitude, longitude, and the occasional dotted line showing the camel track that may or may not have existed anymore. For most people, this would have been a nightmare. For Sadler, it was irresistible. By the time they arrived at Kufra, he'd effectively fallen in love with celestial navigation. The Long Range Desert Group offered him the chance to be the unit navigator, which he accepted instantly. Some months later, the SAS had just suffered its disastrous first parachute mission. Of the 65 men who took part in Operation Squatter, only 22 were left. David Sterling was under pressure. One more failure and the SAS would be disbanded. He needed a miracle. What he got instead was Mike Sadler and the LRDG. The Long Range Desert Group were asked to escort the SAS on their next operation, and Sadler was attached as navigator to their mission commander, Blair Paddymayne.
Well, if it's action that you're after, go with Paddymayne.
The two got on brilliantly. They were similar in some ways. Quiet, confident, unimpressed by bad leadership, and extremely good at what they did. The raid on Tamet airfield in December 1941 changed everything. With Sadler navigating the convoy across the desert in darkness, without proper maps, they arrived precisely on target. The SAS destroyed over 20 aircraft, blew up fuel dumps, and killed or wounded about 30 Italian and German troops. It saved the regiment from being shut down and cemented Sadler as one of the most valuable men in the entire Desert War. Then came Sidi Haneish in July 1942, one of the most famous SAS raids ever conducted. Rogue Heroes gives us a dramatic firestorm, and the show is correct. It was absolute chaos in the best way possible. But behind the scenes, what mattered most was Sadler. He navigated 18 jeeps across the desert without headlights, without proper maps, and without stopping. Under the cover of darkness, Mayne and Sterling led the charge across the airfield. Machine guns blazing, and the result was devastating. Over 35 aircraft destroyed. Sadler's job afterwards was typical of him. He waited at the edge of the airfield to make sure that every jeep escaped. By the time he drove off at dawn, he accidentally merged into a column of German vehicles who were looking out for the raiders. In classic Sadler fashion, he just drove straight through them. Germans, sitting down for a nice cup of tea, didn't really question the lone jeep approaching from behind. Because who on earth would be mad enough to do that? In early 1943, now a lieutenant, Sadler joined David Sterling on a reconnaissance mission in Tunisia. They were captured by the Germans, but Sadler and 2 comrades escaped, crossing 100 miles of desert with almost no water and absolutely no maps. One American journalist described him upon arrival as looking like an emaciated and slightly dotted Paul Verlaine, which is both insulting and a little poetic. A perfect summary of wartime journalism. He would serve with the British 8th Army until the end of the Desert Campaign. He did not go to Italy, hence why you don't see him in Season 2 of the show. He returned to Scotland in early 1944 and trained SAS members prior to the D-Day operations. He would parachute into France as part of Operation Helmsworth in August 1944. His flair for casually driving past Germans continued in France. During one operation east of Orleans, Sadler and another SAS jeep encountered a heavily armoured German patrol on a busy road. But instead of panicking, Sadler just drove slowly past them, waved politely, and carried on. Only when he had passed them did the Germans realise these extremely confident men were not theirs. They opened fire. Sadler whipped the jeep around, knocked out 2 machine gun crews, and still got his men out alive. He received the Military Cross for that display of nerves stronger than steel. By the end of the war, he was adjutant to Paddymayne, now the SAS's commanding officer. With the regiment temporarily disbanded, the pair did what any normal war heroes would do. They went to Antarctica. Sadler helped establish a new base at Stonington Island, earning the Polar Medal. And when a glacier melted later, the newly exposed channel was named Sadler's Passage, which is fitting for a man who spent his whole life finding impossible routes through impossible landscapes. Back in Britain, Sadler worked briefly for the US Embassy before being recruited into MI6. He played a role in Cold War strategy, and even in deception operations during the Falklands War involving Exocet missiles. He served until the mid-1980s, when he retired and enjoyed a life of sailing. In 2018, he was made a Knight of the French Legion of Honour. Despite losing his eyesight, Sadler lived long enough to celebrate his 100th birthday with members of the Special Forces Club in London. He unfortunately passed away in January 2024 at the age of 103, the last surviving member of the original SAS. And he was a living reminder that sometimes the quietest men do the boldest things. And while SAS Rogue Heroes captures his calmness, his intelligence, and the slight air of mystery that surrounded him, it could never fully show the extent of his skill. You can dramatise a gunfight. You can't dramatise a man navigating 700 miles of empty desert using the position of the sun and then calmly driving through a German convoy because he felt like it. Mike Sadler didn't need theatrics, chaos, or fame. He simply needed a direction, and he would lead men safely through whatever stood between them and home. And that was his genius. That is his legacy. So he's not just the last of the original SAS members to die, he's one of the greatest desert navigators who ever lived, and an SAS legend and a true British hero. Enjoyed this dive into one of the many rogue heroes and want to hear more real stories behind the legends? Hit like, subscribe, and let me know who you'd like to see next. Because sometimes history doesn't need a rewrite, it just needs to be told properly.
Did you miss the desert when you left the desert, Mike?
Very much. I knew I was going to miss it. I was very sorry to leave. The war was over, but it wasn't the war that I liked, it was the desert. And that was part of what I really enjoyed, was travelling over the desert.